Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we're welcoming back a returning guest, Layla Al-Sheik, who is an expert in, Palestine, the Middle East politics. And, we had them on earlier to, talk about the Gaza war, right when it first kicked off, I believe. And so, we thought it would be a good time to sort of take stock because there's some developments afoot. In Gaza, I think it's fair to say some really, really bad ones, but also some, potentially things might be changing. So welcome to the program, Layla.
Thank you for having me. Yes, the last couple of weeks and months in Gaza has been a harrowing experience. We've reached a point to where many experts in hunger and in famine have said we're at a point of no return. It's now time to mitigate and potentially try our best to reverse the hunger, but the hunger already exists after a months-long siege, after months-long collective punishment. And in the interim, in the meantime, capitals across Europe and across the political spectrum in the United States as well have begun to dramatically ratchet up their criticisms of this genocidal onslaught. You see things happening in Paris, you see things happening in London, and now you also see in the United States, especially in the last couple of days, Democrats from across the political spectrum and even a handful of Republicans begin to take a step back from the ironclad support for this war. And so perhaps it's a bit too premature to say it, but maybe now there's a dam breaking effect.
Yeah, I agree. That seems to be, what's happened. I mean, even over the last couple of days. I want to bring this up a little bit later, but, Isaac Chotiner at the New Yorker did one of his trademark eviscerations of one of the, a right-wing, Israeli journalist who's been, best buds with Netanyahu for a long time. And the guy was just came off, of course, the most dissembling freak ever, but it was like clearly like he had written an article in a Israeli publication called The Free Press, or I think maybe it was Barry Weiss's thing. Anyway, he wrote an article saying like there might be a hunger problem in Gaza. And you're sort of like that guy, I can see his, blinkered, motivations, but you're seeing a lot of people, Hillary Clinton, Richie Torres of all people,
Yes.
Hitherto fanatically Zionist politicians in America coming around saying, ooh,
Yes.
This doesn't look so good. Yeah. And I guess, there's a couple of items here that seem to be influencing it. I mean, it's just like it's becoming so undeniable now that it seems to be penetrating even the thickest skulls in politics. Just these images coming out of babies that are, stick thin, glazed over eyes. And the repeated reports, I mean, this was happening every couple of days for like weeks and months at these Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, quote unquote, aid dispersion sites where the, IDF and American contractors would just shoot people. They just, blast them with live ammunition. And this former Green Beret guy who has been working with these GHF, he has been doing a media round. He's going on Democracy Now! And he talked to Senator Chris Van Hollen, just describing in the starkest terms the Israeli military using not only, rifles, firearms, but even like artillery shells and mortar, just blasting apart, groups of people who are starving and begging for food. I mean, it's horrifying. I wrote about this the other day and it was so upsetting, just to even have to look at it. I think it's good to, write about it and make the case for getting aid in, but, you could traumatize yourself looking at that too much. And let's see, maybe people were discussing that this Ezra Klein article in the New York Times actually might have moved the needle a fair bit. And, I think there's maybe something to that. Klein wrote this article, which is his classic sort of very methodical, not the kind of blistering prose that I would tend to use. But, he's a guy who's very plugged in among the type of centrist Democrats, who have been previously wavering on this. And I think that his article was, to his credit, perfectly pitched to that type of person. He's not, coming out with a sort of key poundy thing saying, stop killing the babies, even though I think that would be entirely appropriate. But I think it was much more convincing the way that he did it. And he was, by the end of the article, it was quite clear what he thought was happening, that it's a, at the minimum, mass starvation of defenseless civilians. So, of those things, what's your sort of sense as to, which ones predominated in terms of changing the behavior of elites and so on?
I think to go to the last thing you mentioned, the Ezra Klein article, I found it particularly striking because there's a fair bit that you can give to Ezra Klein. Obviously, a lot of people nowadays will say, "Oh, I can't believe Ezra Klein is saying this." And to his minimal credit, he's been a critic of Israel to whatever degree one might be within like the center-left sphere since at least 2018. But it would be wrong to say that he hasn't evolved on this issue. Like if you go back and listen to his interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates, he was grilling Mr. Coates on things that now Klein says himself in this article. And he was much more, in my opinion, having listened to both and read both transcripts, he was far more amicable towards Amit Siegel, the right-winger who Sheldon just interviewed. And now Ezra Klein is saying many of the same things Coates did, which Coates wrote that book about, in which he said, this is a system of racial domination, which exists not just within the West Bank, but across the entire regime that Israel constitutes, which is both the 1967 territories that it occupies and the 1948 territories that most countries recognize as their sovereign territory. And he was pilloried for that at the time. He went on CBS, and that anchor told him that his book was the book of an extremist. It would be in the backpack of an extremist. And now it's being reproduced in more center-left circles. I think that's an indication of where things are going. And Klein's article, like you said, it wasn't so ham-fisted. It didn't immediately come out and say, this is genocide. It didn't immediately. In fact, I don't think he uses the term outright. But he does make the case that it's a starvation. But I also thought it was interesting that he focuses on the broader structure a lot. This is something I remember we talked about when I came on last. This is an apartheid system, at minimum. Even if you were to quibble over the use of the term genocide, which I do not think you should do at this point, it's obviously a genocidal onslaught. There have obviously been acts of genocide committed. This is an attempt to, at the very least, make the Gaza Strip uninhabitable, which is in itself an attempt to eradicate in whole or in part a people and their ability to sustain life. That's genocide. But Klein's piece goes beyond this and talks about how it's not sustainable for self-identified liberals who proclaim to adhere to universal values, freedom, democracy, liberal democratic principles, this Westphalian and modern principle of sovereignty. It's not possible to maintain that on the one hand. And on the other hand, say that racial domination by 7 million people onto another 7 million people is a sustainable practice. It wasn't in South Africa. It wasn't in Rhodesia. It isn't in Israel-Palestine, especially not if one claims that that's incompatible, it has a compatibility with Western principles or with the proclaimed principles of the West. So there's that. I also think, to your point about this shift among the center left, you have people like Richie Torres, as far as I'm aware, isn't even a two-stater outright. He'll make gestures towards, self-governance. He says in recent days, we need to find a new path of Palestinian self-governance in the Gaza Strip. That's not calling for a sovereign state. It could very easily be some form of putative Palestinian authority or some transitional council like the Biden administration had envisioned. But even he, granted that he's this far right on the issue, even he has been waxing enough criticism. Beyond that interview he did with Chuck Todd yesterday, he said that this is very much like an Iraq war situation, that this is a quagmire, that it erodes Israel's international legitimacy and that it's not possible to support this anymore. And, if he's not being motivated by the disgusting images coming out of the Gaza Strip, he's at the very least motivated by the impact of them. And that tells you something about where we are. I think I had read the Chodner interview before coming on. The untenability of this claim that there's no hunger, which is odd because Ahmet Siegel wrote that piece for Bari Weiss's Free Press, in which he implicitly admits that there is hunger. But then he goes on to Chodner's show and says, there is no hunger in the Gaza Strip. It's not tenable. It's not tenable to have photographs of these emaciated children on the front pages of the New York Times, and then to claim afterwards, well, this child has cystic fibrosis. That's not tenable. Children with cystic fibrosis still need to eat. There's a reason that these children are skin and bones. There's a reason that they're not able to sustain themselves. It's because there's no food. And the reason there's no food is because the occupying power prevents them from being food. And so even the most apathetic, even the most disinterested center-left politician or person who has felt inclined towards the Israeli narrative, they can't sustain this contradiction in their mind, I don't think. Children are children. And so
I mean, I would guess that
yes.
they're hard to see into their own mind, but I'm a little more cynical in the sense that they've probably known the truth for a long, long time, but they didn't think they could sustain the lies to the people that hold power over them any longer, given the pictures of emaciated children. And I mean, there's been so many pictures and so much testimony from doctors and soldiers, and
yes.
It is kind of arbitrary because it's been so overwhelmingly obvious what's been going on that it is interesting interesting and terrible to see that, like, okay, at some point, those in power feel pressured that they can't lie anymore to cover for this. The cynical take that I heard that is even more upsetting is that now it's okay to speak out against it because it's a fait accompli. It's basically irreversible, the damage it's done. 70% of Gaza has been destroyed. They're well on their way to ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so now speaking out against it is in a way
Safer.
not doing much. And so that's a kind of, I don't know, what do you think about that kind of take on why now?
I think it's true to some extent. I think there are definitely people who see that, the reports indicate that we are at a point of no return to the previous threshold. It's now about mitigation. It's about flooding the territory with as much food as possible, an unmitigated amount of food. The airdrops are a public relations stunt. There's no way to prevent further death happening. The question is now, how much further death can we prevent? How much can we mitigate the issue? And so now that the threshold has been crossed, plenty of people feel like perhaps it's time to talk out. But I do think that it's not a fait accompli in the sense that oftentimes when I speak to people, I think, and even before the war had begun, I think a lot of people have come to a conclusion that the question of Palestine is going the way of, or has already gone the way of, the question of Native Americans. And I don't think the question of Native Americans has been completed, first of all. I think that's an erroneous framework to begin with. It's foolish. But secondly, the issue is not nearly that dire. The democracy is not the same. The political context is not the same outright. There are many parallels, of course, especially in the occupied West Bank. But that type of fatalism allows people to simply think there's nothing to be done. It enables them to not do anything in the current moment. But the war could end today. If the Europeans decided today to suspend all trade, contingent on the war ending, the war could end today. If Donald Trump picked up the phone and told Netanyahu the war had to end today, he could make the war end today. And with that, food could flood the territory and reconstruction could begin. For all the faults and evil of like the Arab states and their complicity, there are reconstruction plans that have been crafted on a 5-year, 10-year scale. There are ways to build these genuine humanitarian corridors, real humanitarian corridors where the Palestinians of Gaza can live while neighborhoods are reconstructed and food sustainability is rebuilt. It is possible to rebuild the Strip. I do not think the Strip as it used to exist is no longer a thing, obviously. 90% of infrastructure is gone. Entire neighborhoods are gone. All of the universities, the hospitals. But it is not, the question of Palestine is not foreclosed. It's still as alive as it is today as it was 3 years ago, 5, 10, and 20.
Yeah,
and I think that's what
point.
scares a lot of people. So,
It's actually a very important point you're making, because right now there's alternative visions, right? Because there's the, at this point, the Donald Trump, let's make beachfront property and make money off expelling all the Gazans,
yes.
you know, and or we can fill it with a leftist vision, the most humane possibility we can imagine, and what does that look like? And it's so important to speak to what needs to be done in the right way. I think that's.
I was going to say, I think it really does need to be emphasized. Like, as many, especially in the context of growing pressure in Europe, it's great that these states are now saying, well, they'll recognize the state of Palestine on paper. It's great that they'll speak about threatening action, but it's overdue. And if they did take action, Europe is the biggest trading partner of the Israelis. If they took action today, they could compel a fundamental change. And if a fundamental change were to take place, then a great many possibilities are opened up politically, economically, and they all have to center the principles of Palestinian steadfastness in the land, of being able to stay in the land, and being able to govern their destiny in the land.
Yeah. And I think another key point, in that vein is that, Gaza is just like on the edge of mass death. As you say, like, starvation is a very long process. It takes you a long time, sometimes over a month to die of starvation. But once you're close, then it can be very hard to bring you back. There's famous stories about people who liberated concentration camps, death camps in, Nazi-occupied Europe, and they accidentally killed people by giving them like bars of chocolate and stuff. And their systems were so broken down they couldn't handle it. But the West Bank is not there yet. And I think that the Israeli right, their basically final solution to the apartheid question is like, well, it's unsustainable to dominate these 7 million people indefinitely. Let's just get rid of them, get rid of all of them. And there's like shocking amount of support for doing that in the Israeli Jewish public. I saw a poll from Haaretz that said 82% of Israeli Jews support exiling, like evicting, deporting, whatever you want to call it, expelling, I think was the word they used, or at least translated to, everyone in Gaza. 47% supported just outright killing everyone, man, woman, and child in Gaza. And 56% supported expelling the Israeli Arab citizens of Israel, who are about a fifth of the population, if I'm not mistaken. And so
keep in mind, Ryan, that since October 7th, there have been nearly 1,000, I think, Palestinians in the West Bank killed, which is, I believe, more than the civilians killed on October 7th, Israelis, right? Like, if you take away the soldiers that were killed, I think so. Like, that just has not been talked about hardly at all. Right?
Yeah. And the Israeli government has also drastically stepped up settlements in the West Bank. They authorized the biggest expansion in decades. I think it was in May. And just last week, I believe, authorized like another $274 million, if I recall correctly, for settlement funding. And so I think the plan was, and maybe still is, at least among certain segments of the Israeli right, once we're finished with Gaza, then we're going to take the West Bank. And so if we can, hopefully we can rebuild Gaza and save the people. But even if you could just stop them from genociding the West Bank too, that itself would be an accomplishment. Albeit that's a low bar, to say the least. On that question of Europe, though, as you mentioned, you sent us this article in Le Monde that's like the long history of French waffling over whether or not to recognize a Palestinian state, which itself wouldn't accomplish much. But to your point, I actually looked this up. Israel is the EU accounts for a third of Israeli trade, and is a very, very small fraction of the EU's trade. So the EU could devastate the Israeli economy by refusing to accept imports or exports. And while at very little cost, presumably some small segments would get, hurt. But like the EU economy is gigantic, huge. It's as big as the American economy almost. And Israel is a small country. It's just not that important in the grand scheme of such an enormous economy. So what prospect do you think there is to, apply some pressure and just, force Netanyahu to stop this horror?
I think, well, first I want to speak a little bit to the recognition issue, because it's a divisive one among Palestinians. I think many people rightfully see recognition as something that's the bare minimum. It's our fundamental right. Yesterday, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Starmer, or it may have been the day before, Starmer announced that he's pivoting. Previously, he had said recognition will only come after a permanent ceasefire, but now he's reversing the incentives and placing the onus on the Israelis by saying that unless the Israelis agree to a litany of steps, including unmitigated humanitarian aid through United Nations agencies, end to the war, and a vague set of steps towards permanent peace, then the UK will recognize the state of Palestine. And this is, in the narrow sense, it's good to place onus on the Israelis, but it's also a bit of a cynical issue, because then what you're saying is that recognition of our inalienable rights is contingent upon Israeli behavior. No, it should just be our inalienable right. Recognition should have been done decades ago. So on the one hand, recognition is our due, right? We deserve it. It's good for it to have been given by the French. The Canadians should follow suit. The rest of Europe should follow suit, and so on. But on the other, it's woefully inadequate in the context of 2 years of massacre, of genocidal onslaughts, of the entire Gaza Strip being flattened. It's a symbolic declaration of disgruntlement at best. And so, to your question of what is the prospect of real pressure being applied, because, it'll make Netanyahu angry, it'll make the opposition angry, because they also oppose the Palestinian state. It's not like Lapid or Golan want partition to happen as soon as possible. They view this as an embarrassment, a diplomatic setback, so on. But it just makes them angry. What will actually compel Israel? And that's a suspension of the EU-Israel Association Agreement, which is in effect their trade agreement. It encompasses economics, like imports and exports. It encompasses Israeli participation in research programs like the Horizon program. It encompasses military cooperation, and so on. And partial suspension of the program, such as like suspending them from the Horizon program, which has hundreds of millions of dollars in research grants for tech startups, and so on and so forth. That's currently what's being debated at the EU Commission. They were supposed to take a vote yesterday, but German and Italian intransigence has caused a delay. It's not clear how they'll vote. But that requires a partial majority, or a qualified majority. Not a qualified majority, a simple majority. So only, I think, 15 out of the 27 states in the European Union are required to vote in order for a partial suspension. Unfortunately, for a total suspension of the agreement, it requires unanimity. And so Germany, Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Czechia, they'll likely never agree to such things. But on the flip side, about a month ago, the EU Commission issued a memorandum which acknowledges that each member state has the right now, or clarifies a pre-existing question, which says that now each state has the right to issue sanctions on the Israeli government individually, and also to ban importing the importation of Israeli settler goods. So France could do that today if they wanted to. Ireland is working on it. Famously, they're trying to pass the Occupied Territories Bill, which would ban goods and services from the Israeli settlement enterprise, including in East Jerusalem. That's a meaningful pressure valve because, 1 in 10 Israeli Jews live in occupied territory. The settlements provide an economic incentive. There's a real economic incentive there. And so banning that would be meaningful. But it can't just be Ireland. It has to be Spain, France. The UK should do it even though they're not in the EU. These are meaningful levers. I think it's more likely than ever. But my impression after having talked to French analysts and having talked to British analysts is that the French prefer symbolic measures and the British prefer actionable measures. But on the one hand, Starmer is reticent to do anything. And on the other, Macron is reticent to go alone. He took a long time to do something on his own in terms of recognition. And so if he were to do something actionable, it would require him convincing Britain or convincing Germany. So it's unclear. I think we're at an impasse now where anger is at an all-time high. It's undeniably at an all-time high. But the willingness of states to do something hasn't really moved yet. And I don't know what will break that impasse yet.
Yeah. Yeah, pretty toxic interaction between, on the one hand, the showboating, like stuffed shirt Macron and the complete, utter non-entity that is Keir Starmer. I think
it's very impressive.
I was just telling Alexi that I think, was it General Patton who's famously said I could carve a better man out of a banana? But like, you listen to it, just sitting there next to Donald Trump Trump's insulting the mayor of London just egregiously. And he's just sitting there taking it, like, God, what a worm. But
I saw that it was widely perceived that Starmer only decided to issue this recognition statement because Trump himself said, recognize or don't recognize, I don't care. And that's why it was the green light of sorts. You seek permission from the president of the United States. Why be prime minister? Why be prime minister if you seek permission from some other country?
Yeah, God. But on the U.S. question, I wanted to bring up another thing, which is the polling that's coming out, and especially the victory of Zoran Mamdani in the New York City mayoral primary. Because they tried to run the usual anti-Semitism playbook on him. Because he is an anti-Zionist, because he has been very critical of the war in Gaza, there was just these preposterous questions about, in the New York City mayoral primary, what's the first foreign country you're going to go visit? And everyone said Israel except for him. And he's like, I'm going to stay in New York City. Why am I going to other countries? But not only did he win, the latest polling I've seen shows that he has the support of a plurality of New York City Jews after just a harrowing propaganda campaign of people calling him basically a member of Hamas and whatnot. And you look at the debates where, they ask him, do you support Israel's right to exist? And he says, yes, as a democratic state with equal rights. And when you put it like that, it's, you're like, so what's the problem then? It's just that you take out the Zionist apartheid thing and you put it under, the light and describe it how it is. It's unsupportable in any kind of liberal democratic framework. And you see this polling among Democrats. I think you were posting about this earlier on Blue Sky, that Democrats have now become overwhelmingly hostile to Israel. They support, basically pulling aid and weapons shipments from Israel by like a 40, 50 point margin. And I think that probably explains a lot of how the behavior of people like Richie Torres has changed. They're looking down the barrel of a primary challenge that's going to destroy them in the reverse way that they attempted to destroy Zoran. And so, what do you think about this change in the opinion of Democratic voters and how it's influencing things?
I think to some extent I've underestimated it, which is somewhat surprising because it's the primary issue that I've written about for a couple of years now. I was writing about it months before October 7. Certainly on a generational level, young people are far more Israel skeptical. They're far more pro-Palestine. Something that I've told great reporters like Peter Stern, of City and State in New York. We've talked about this quite a lot. And what is happening, I think, is you have, on the one hand, older Americans who view Israel within this post-war international system where, Israel was enshrined as a way of, first and foremost, sort of an apology, I don't know necessarily the right way to frame it, but, a post-Holocaust gift, something of a way to realign values in Western Europe and the United States. And on the other hand, Israel is also seen as an extension of Western values because it was enshrined on paper as a democratic state, no matter the details of, how Palestinian citizens were treated prior to 1967 or how the occupation has distorted the state since then. But on the other hand, you have younger people who have grown up, especially in the United States, younger Black people, younger Latinos, younger everybody. They've grown up in the context of Black Lives Matter, and they've grown up in the context of a globalized media system. And so they see what happened to George Floyd. and they see what happens to West Bankers every day. And they see there's a connection there. They see there's something happening that's not all that dissimilar from one another. There's a huge gap in scale. Military law is meaningfully different from what happens in the U.S. in terms of police brutality, no matter how bad it is in the United States as well. But there's something there for a lot of Americans. That's what clicks for them. And that's a meaningfully different distinction. What surprises me, though, is that polling shows that older Americans on the Democratic side have become more Israel skeptical. Something like a 20-point swing among older Americans over the last couple of years in terms of, do you view them positively or negatively, the state of Israel? And that's obviously because of what's happened in Gaza. I don't think anybody, young or old, likes the images that they see that come out. It's indefensible. So there's that. And then there's also an underrated interplay between elite and public consciousness. A lot of people think elite consciousness is purely insular, like it's not able to be pierced out by the public consciousness. And that's true to some extent. Obviously, Democratic leadership has succeeded quite well at ignoring this shift for the last couple of decades. But all it takes is a couple of hits, and then things start to crumble and they start to realign. In 2018, AOC, Tlaib, and Omar represented that first sort of pierce of the veil. Previously, it was only someone like Betty McCollum from, I don't remember, Illinois or Minnesota, this mild-mannered white woman who mildly criticizes the occupation. Previously, it was just her in the House. And now it's suddenly these three women of color who call it an apartheid system, who call it genocide. And now we have Zohran Mamdani, a Ugandan Indian who calls himself of the third world, who says that it's the colonial system that's happening with U.S. taxpayer dollars supporting it, calls it a genocide, calls it apartheid, says he supports the right to exist as an equal state, not as a Jewish supremacist state. And that influences the public in turn. His win affirms for people that being pro-Israel is not a viable litmus test anymore. And so I think we're going to see an acceleration of things from here on out. Him breaking through. Go ahead.
No, just that the Mamdani win, as you're just saying, it's not only that you can win if you're pro-Palestine, but you're not as protected. Like Cuomo wasn't protected by just speaking the AIPAC line. And so
yes.
Just taking money and doing what AIPAC wants isn't going to keep you in power. And so you have to recalculate, right? And like, this is always how it's been, that the elites have to recalculate what they do when popular, not just opinion, but pressure changes their recalculation of their own interests, right? And so also similarly, It strikes me that like, as soon as other centrists or former AIPAC toadies start changing their position, that's kind of cover, because then you can too without being targeted by, you won't be targeted by AIPAC if like, oh, okay, now we're all changing slightly our position. Okay, I'm going to fall in line, right? And that's interesting.
Yes, and I think something that I struggle to explain to Blue Sky users or say like Twitter users in particular is because most of us, we view things solely through the vector of electoral measures, right? We think of it, well, what will win me an election? And that's important. Obviously, Mamdani won, but I wrote about it in The Nation. It wouldn't be accurate to say Mamdani ran on Palestine, right? He ran on affordable housing. He ran on freezing the rent, free bus fare, all those things. But at the same time, the media establishment in Cuomo ran on Israel. And that fell flat because of two things. One, the electorate within the Democratic Party just doesn't care anymore. That's not a thing. If they ever did in the first place, which I think is more dubious than many would assume, the electorate, that is, they don't now. There's that. And also, the organizational structures and the incentives that they provide are changing. No one's ever going to run solely on foreign policy in the United States. It's not feasible. Most people care about housing more than they care about any issue abroad. But for younger, highly educated liberals, and that's the thing, it's not just left-wing people anymore, it's liberals. For highly educated liberals, Palestine is a cause célèbre as a stand-in for the question of justice in the same ways as South Africa used to be. And that means people are going to think about Palestine as a question of, do your values indicate that you genuinely believe in the things you're talking about? on other issues? Are you going to actually fight on other issues? And so for Zoran, it was a boon for him that he didn't concede to nonsensical framings. It was a boon for him that he was genuine in that he said, this is a occupation. This is an apartheid system. I love Jewish Americans. I will fight for Jewish Americans. I love all people on the planet. And he invoked these liberal universal values. That's going to be a boon for people from here on out, I think, increasingly so. And so, they won't be running on Palestine day in and day out. I don't think Chris Van Hollen's going to run for re-election on Palestine. But Chris Van Hollen's going to say, if we're going to be a meaningful liberal party, if we're going to advocate for a rule set, or we're going to advocate for justice, then that has to be a fundamental part of it.
Layla, what's your view on the kind of, I think it's both and, I'm sure you'll agree, but the welcoming the former defenders of Israel into the tent now, that they're speaking out against Israel's actions, against the genocide, against the ethnic cleansing, versus, the need to hold especially elites and public figures accountable for their use of power or lack of use of power. As the Palestinian American writer's book title says, one day everyone will always have been against this. And the problem with that title is that people get away, just like they did with the Iraq War, get away with being on the wrong side of things, especially when they could have done something about it. And that just perpetuates the likelihood of it happening again, right? So what's your thought on that?
It is a both and. I think I am currently writing something, I think, for The Nation about it. And I think the way I view it personally is I'm obviously incentivized to care about this. I'm a Palestinian myself. It's been at the forefront of my mind since I was a young child. And so it's to some extent always baffling for me when someone is new to it, right? Conceptually, because it's never been new to me. It's been about as long as I've been alive. But I think if you're, a lay person, if you're someone who has not been interested in the issue, if you're someone who's been largely apathetic, but suddenly you're seeing these things and you're disgusted and you think it matters now, or if you were, so for whatever reason, if you were less interested when it was the Democratic administration, which elided in the accountability, but now that it's a Trump administration, you're more so. I think it's good to welcome you, and I think it's good to say, well, we need you to be here to provide accountability to other people. But if you're a Brett McCook, if you're a Jake Sullivan, or if you're a Amos Hochstein who supported invading Lebanon, all of these things, if you're a senior member of a State Department, or if you're a Samantha Power, and you're the type of person who overrode U.S. aid reports about starvation, or if you're the type of person who ignored Leahy law, we cannot let you just say, oh, well, I was always against this. You made this worse. And so they, at minimum, should never serve in public life again, at minimum. At maximum, it should be a litmus test, I think, for people in the future. Are you going to take the advice of a Brett McCook? I recall during I think it was 2016. I was young at the time. I think it was Bernie who was like, I'm proud to have never taken the advice of Kissinger, I'll never take the advice of Kissinger. Yeah. That should be the minimum. That really should be the minimum of people going forward.
Yeah, it's one thing.
I don't know. It's hard to think of how to hold someone accountable, but I think that should at the very least be the minimum. Go ahead.
Yeah. It's one thing to be like, okay, like older Jewish liberal who sort of intentionally blinded himself to what was happening. I can see we can cut you a little bit of slack, but when you're actually just implicated in the war crimes, not so much.
Or journalists or pundits who know better or should know better, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good point as well. Like a Brett Stevens or even a Thomas Friedman, I would say, who to his credit was attempting to perhaps navigate what was the centrist blob at the time. But even him, he a lot of the time invoked extremely racist principles or carried water for this idea that, you have to go into Rafah or all these things. Like, people should remember this. This is a type of issue. Everything with the New York Times, the disgusting retraction or clarification that they issued on that photo of the child with cystic fibrosis. That's just fundamentally, everyone knows it would never have happened on the on the opposite end. They would never do that for a Jewish victim of a Palestinian attack.
It's so
And-
sick.
and
Layla,
yet it's accepted.
can you tell the audience what happened with the New York Times there, in case they don't know?
Yes. I'm sure those who use any platform would know, but for those who don't know, I don't remember the young boy's name, and I tend to avoid looking at these photos myself because it's too heartbreaking for me. I see my sisters, I see my family when I look at these things, so it hurts me fundamentally. But it was a young boy who had been totally emaciated. It was a disgusting image of a child who, and I don't think someone will have to correct me. I don't know if they're still alive, if the boy is still alive, but it was a child who was completely emaciated. And it was on the A1, the front page of the New York Times, I think. And then these, for those who don't know, there's a massive industry of Israeli and Jewish organizations whose priority is to correct the record in American and British and European media when it comes to Israel Palestine. One of them is Honest, I think is the acronym, and there's like Camera, that's another acronym, and their job is to just dog these organizations with accusations on anything, no matter what it is. They'll dog them with accusations. This is bias. This is you omitted a fact, something like that. And so the same routine happened here, and somehow they found out that this child has cystic fibrosis. And so the New York Times issues a statement saying this child who is starved, emaciated, they also had a pre-existing condition. That's something we have to tell you. And what difference does it make? A child with cystic fibrosis still needs food. This is an emaciated child.
It makes it worse. If you have a chronic condition like that, it's more important for you to maintain a healthy, diet.
Yes.
We're not just starving the healthy babies; that they're starving the special needs and the most vulnerable. It reminds me actually during COVID when people would not care about certain deaths. They say, well, some of those people were going to die anyway because they were in bad health. It's like, oh, so that's okay. So the most vulnerable, if they die, it's okay because in a eugenics perspective, that they were pretty weak anyway. So whatever. I guess.
I think I think I'm going to mispronounce her last name, but a wonderful scholar on Blue Sky, Dr. Alice Cruikshanks, I believe is her last name. She made the excellent point. This is the exact same argument used in the 1990s against a child, I think, named Fikret Alk by Bosnian genocide deniers. Like this is it was in a Living Marxism magazine. They claimed that this emaciated individual behind barbed wire had a pre-existing condition, and no matter what, if they had a pre-existing condition, why are they behind barbed wire? Why are they denied food? Why are they being ethnically cleansed? It's the exact same playbook. You see it here. You see it 30 years ago, and I mean, it's not. I don't like to invoke historical tragedies on principle. I don't think it's fair to be comparable, but it should also be noted. I mean, how did Anne Frank die? She didn't die via a bullet wound. She didn't die in the camp. She died of typhus, something of that sort, an illness. And would you say she wasn't killed by the Nazi regime? She was.
By the way, all the numbers, whatever the numbers are, the 60,000 dead is definitely under what the actual number is of just like bombings and shootings and military deaths. But I don't know why people just ignore all the deaths from whether it's starvation or illness or lack of access to other needs. I mean, it's
there
insane.
There are no hospitals anymore. There are no operable hospitals anymore. Even the Indonesian field hospital was bombed by the Israelis. It doesn't matter what you're doing in the strip. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter whether you're sick or healthy. They view you as a combatant. It's been well established by Israeli newspapers, by British newspapers. It's been established by whistleblowers like the Green Beret. It doesn't matter who you are. And that's the point. The point is that they want to make it uninhabitable and incapable of you to live. So to induce you either to leave or to simply kill you.
Yeah.
That's what it is.
Worth mentioning that the reason why, for instance, like before the advent of modern medicine, most people in wars died of disease rather than being shot. It was because that's a very ideal situation for disease to spread. You know, I have a lot of people, you know, in like the Napoleonic army in Russia, they're cramped together. They have unsanitary conditions. They don't have enough food. And so their bodies are weak and more vulnerable to infection. That's, you know, how you get lots and lots of deaths. And so like the types of disease spreading in Gaza is the fault of the Israeli occupation.
Well, with one difference that makes it worse. In the other wars, there are military objectives and the civilian population dies as like collateral damage. Here, the civilian population is being targeted both by military weapons and by starvation and the tactics to destroy like access to water and food and medical care. Like it's worse than those historical examples.
Well, no, I'm not saying it's the same. It's just that the conditions for like actual soldiers
cause those things.
And the way that they were living. There's one last thing I wanted to bring up real quick, to just turn back on the change in opinion among, you know, Americans, Europeans, and so on. And this is something that, well, there's kind of two parts to it. One of them was brought up in that Ezra Klein piece, I thought, in a pretty good way. He said, quote, many of the Trump administration's attacks on civil society in America have been thinly justified as attempts to combat anti-Semitism, particularly at universities. All this as President J.D. Vance is giving speeches in which he insists Americanness is yoked to the number of your ancestors buried here in this soil, not your commitment to the ideals and success of this country. Anti-Semitism is serving as a beard for an assault on the ideals and institutions that have made America into a place where Jews can flourish. If Israel becomes a right-wing ethno-state, and if opposition to that state is anti-Semitic, then Jews will become mascots for a politics that would have made the Jewish diaspora unthinkable. And the second part of it is just the sort of flip side of that thing, in which, you know, if all the Israeli propagandists and the Netanyahu government and so on and so forth, and they insist that being anti-Zionism is anti-Semitic by definition, you raise the risk that a number of people will simply conclude, well, okay, I guess I'm an anti-Semite then. And they'll start buying into all the usual crackpot theories, you know, protocols, the elders of Zion and all of that shit. Talking about, you know, Zionist occupied government and whatnot. And so, you know, do you think that's having an effect on, you know, I mean, especially the American Jewish population, but also, you know, the like broader, you know, Western publics and elites writ large?
I think so. I think it's impossible for me to input on what the American Jewish population is experiencing, but I do think in a broader sense, obviously I would quibble a little bit with Ezra Klein's if Israel turns into an ethno-state. I obviously think it's been one for quite a long time, but you know, differences degrees. I think the sheer logical. I think just a little bit later in that same piece, he says something to the effect of, if one thinks that the maintenance of a Jewish and democratic state, which is the framework of maintaining a Jewish demography while having a semblance of liberal democracy, to whatever extent that's possible, of course. If one thinks that's the goal, then what it traditionally labeled anti-Semitic movements like the BDS be in fact a friend to those who want to curtail Israeli excesses. I think that's something of an argument he makes, you know, like, if you are trying to maintain this, then how are you going to do that? You have to at some point believe in some action. Likewise, Omer Bartov, the Holocaust and genocide scholar, who's from Israel, I believe, and who served in the IDF, he wrote that piece explaining why he believes it's a genocide in the New York Times just a couple of weeks ago. In a more telling interview after the fact, also in the New York Times, he says something to the effect of, the trajectory that he sees is one in which Israel no longer exists. And whether that means no longer as a Jewish state or otherwise, he believes that this is a trajectory in which it's untenable. It's completely untenable. And a lot of people think that the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is an immutable fact. A lot of people thought the existence of South Africa as a white state was an immutable fact. Things are not. A lot of people thought the Iron Curtain was an immutable fact. Things are not immutable ever, and in which you in a state in which you have this ever expanding military apparatus which seizes more territory in Syria and Lebanon and beyond, it's increasingly difficult to have 7 million people rule over more than 7 million people. And I think that scares a lot of people. I think the likes of Torres, the likes of Nadler, the likes of a lot of Jewish American leaders and American leaders and European leaders, they think it's now time to some extent to try to rein in the worst impulses of the Israeli state. Will they do that? I don't know.
You look at, a background to this is that, Netanyahu is a crook, and, is quite clearly attempting to do some kind of, at least like a hybrid authoritarian regime, even if like, Israeli Jews got to keep, some kind of quote unquote voting rights. Like he wanted to turn it into Hungary or something like that, just another tin pot dictatorship, out in the middle of nowhere, increasingly internationally isolated. And yeah, I've sort of gone back and forth on this question, of whether or not like Israel could actually win, like in their sense, like in the goals of the right wing extremists, that they could get away with it, that Israel could end up stronger by just getting rid of all those 7 million people. But I think if you care about Israel as an institution that isn't just, a corrupt tin pot dictatorship, it's undeniable that they need to get this straightened out. There needs to be a permanent settlement that isn't genocide, or it's going to end up. Go ahead.
I agree. I think the thing, going back to what I was saying before about how people treat the question of Palestine, like the question of the Native Americans, and how, the question of the Native Americans isn't a dead one. It's not a dead one. The question is still alive. Likewise, the question of Palestine, prior to the war, many people would tell me, well, we're on the way to full normalization of all the Arab states and Israel, and the question of Palestine will no longer be a central question. But yet here we are today. I mean, it is still the central question. It's been the central question since 1948 in the form of the refugee question, and since the 1960s, it has become an innately political question. And attempts to sideline it through Camp David with Sadat as a form of autonomy, and attempts to sideline it through Oslo as a form of Bantustanization, and attempts to segment the Gaza Strip from the West Bank. All of these things have failed. Palestinian identity is as formidable as ever, as the 2021 Intifada showed, when not just Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank protested, also Palestinians within the Green Line in various cities. They marched for Sheikh Jarrah, and they marched for the East Jerusalem neighborhoods. To now, we have not been erased, and I don't think it's really tenable to erase us. Certainly, they won't succeed in permanently pushing us into the Sinai. And even if one envisions a scenario where they somehow did so, or into Jordan, I mean, these are countries, Jordan and Egypt, which are ran by state governments, U.S. vassal regimes, which are friendly to Israel. What happens if they're not there anymore? What happens if a Nasser was back? What happens if a Morsi or a Muslim Brotherhood type came to power, which would almost certainly happen if the Nakba was accelerated to such an extent? There are not really any great options in terms of the eradication route that Israel has steadily put itself towards. And so I do think, as bleak as things are from our perspective, it's not, there's not going to be a great solution for Israelis on that route. Either they return to some South African model or we partition. I don't know. It's a bit difficult to say. Yeah,
certainly hard. But I guess, I don't know. The one heartening thing I took away from that Chotiner interview is that the utterly lying, dishonest way that Israeli propagandists have attempted to cover up, what is going on, and you say, oh, we're definitely feeding everyone, and there's no hunger, and look, everyone's fine. Oh, the cystic fibrosis thing. it runs into reality. You know, at a certain point, even for the most dishonest person like this guy that Chodner was talking about, that like they don't have the guts to actually just go in and do what the Nazis said. It was like, we're just going to go in and we're going to kill everyone, like just straight up. You know, we're not making any bones about it. I mean, they did hide the Holocaust to some degree, but it was wide knowledge, and they went into it with both eyes open. And this like just utter dishonesty that plagues every level of Israeli communication about everything. At least, you know, there's a possibility of the hypocrisy and the dishonesty becoming too much to swallow, even for Israeli right wingers.
Well,
Yes,
it strikes me. It strikes me, Layla, just as we finish up here. We're talking about Ezra Klein and those that are coming around and their changes and their perspective, and to Ryan's point just there about the lies and the hypocrisy being kind of unable to be sustained anymore. I think there's a link between the contradictions of liberal Zionism and the lies of it, right, being untenable. And, you know, when you think of Trump kind of exacerbating the contradictions of liberalism in the United States and showing the true nature of the police state and the true nature of like ICE and so forth, it occurs to me that like the same kind of cover that the Democrats give to the police and Biden trying to like respond to George Floyd by like hiring more cops and funding more cops, and Harris running on being even tougher on the border. Like, we have to change the Ezra Klein's understanding of not just Israel as an apartheid state, but also the link to the United States and the role of the police and ICE and the link between those things. I think there is a kind of perpetuation of this violence because people for Israel, for example, have been able to pretend that, except for Netanyahu, you know, this is a just society, or except for, okay, we have a few problems here. Oh, except for a few bad apples, you know, that kill black people once in a while, the cops are good. Do you see the link there between the need to change the overall understanding of the systems and how they operate?
Yes, I think so. This is a good opportunity to say, for all that I will give credit to Klein for, I think a common through line for him for the last couple of years, and if he ever listens, I would love to talk to him himself. I would say he consistently says he doesn't know what the solution is to his diagnosis, which he is increasingly admitting this is an apartheid system. He's inching towards an admission that this is genocide. But he doesn't know what the solution is. He doesn't think the two-state solution is possible anymore, which is the sort of fiction that a lot of people have subscribed to. But he also isn't able to imagine a singular conceptualization of statehood, equal democratic rights, or isn't able to imagine a confederation, or so on. I think that's a common problem here, too, with us. You know, we talk about ICE, we talk about the police state, we talk about the border, but we're not able to imagine a real alternative. And that's a real problem. I would say, even if partition happened tomorrow, like, even if tomorrow a fully inline international legal partition happened, East Jerusalem, a right of return package of some kind occurred, many Palestinians would tell you the struggle isn't really over, because the struggle isn't just about sovereignty, although that's a significant part of it, especially in this Westphalian context, but it's also about equality. There are still millions of 48 Palestinians, what many people call Israeli Arabs, who want equality under the law. They don't have that. There's no equality. And Ezra Klein, to his credit, admits this in this piece. He says this is a second-class citizenship. It's a racial system, even in the Green Line. But the struggle will continue. And that's true here with the U.S. We get rid of ICE, the struggle will continue. Like, there's still going to be a problem for us. And that's what liberalism is. I think that's what left-wing struggle is, at least a vibrant and resurgent liberalism. That's what that would be, which is that we acknowledge that the struggle will have to continue constantly, and that there are incremental steps to take. There are non-reformist reforms to take that fundamentally alter our political terrain, and we have to take them. Like, we can't skirt around it anymore. Trump has exposed that to us, I think. The continuation of the Nakba in Gaza has exposed that. We see how the right has transcended across the globe by promising this sort of fundamental change. It's time for us to do that as well.
Yeah, there's something Tony Benn once said that I think about a lot. He said it was something like, every generation has to fight the same battles again and again and again. There's no such thing as a destination called justice, and if you catch a train driven by the right man, you'll get there. Every generation has to fight. And yeah, sometimes you're on the back foot, certainly. But
Yes.
if anything gives me hope, it's that it's not that difficult to outline a solution here. Both in the U.S. and in Israel. It's the good old freedom, equality and fraternity. We should have equal rights. We should have a share of resources, and we should live in brotherhood with our fellow human beings. That's probably a good place to wrap it up. But thanks for coming on the show, Layla. And
thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening, everybody. We will see you in the next episode.